The other load balancer we want to talk about is Azure Application Gateway. This is a global load balancer good for web apps or web services. It's a little more flexible in that the backend pool can support multiple kinds of hosts, VMs, VM scale sets, also web apps, or even just a general IP address. It operates at network layer 7. That's the application layer, and particularly the application protocol it understands is HTTP or HTTPS. Those are the only protocols it understands. So if your exam question, let's say, were to talk about needing to load balance something that was not HTTP or HTTPS, then you could not use an application gateway. You'd have to use a standard load balancer. We'll see that there's some nice advantages to working at the HTTP layer. In the general drawing, you can see that this load balancer looks like or operates more or less like a regular load balancer. It's got a front-end IP address. It's got a listener, which is listening on particular IP address and port. And then it has rules, and the rules establish how to map to backend pools. Some features of App Gateway which make it a nice choice. There's multi-site hosting. So this allows you to host multiple applications behind one App Gateway. Since Application Gateway looks at the HTTP request, it can look at the URL requested in the request for HTTP. And the DNS name, like contoso.com or fabricom.com, could be used to determine where to map the request in backend pools. Another feature of Application Gateway that's related to that is URL path-based routing. So again, since we can look at the URL for the incoming request in HTTP, then if the URL contains a folder or path that, let's say, has images as part of its name, then you can have Application Gateway map that to an image pool. Whereas if it contains video, you could map it to a different set of VMs for a video pool. So it's nice to be able to look at the HTTP request to determine information from the URL that can make the routing smarter. Another feature is what's called TLS termination or TLS offloading. So in that, App Gateway decrypts the incoming request that would be encrypted using TLS, and then it sends the unencrypted request to the backend server. The server responds to Application Gateway, and then App Gateway can encrypt it using the same TLS certificate and send it back to the client. This can just save you capacity on servers in the backend pool because they don't have to decrypt and then encrypt requests and responses. Another feature is HTTP redirection. So if you have an incoming request and the user didn't put an S on your HTTP URL, then you can have App Gateway automatically send back a 301 redirect response. The client browser picks that up, uses HTTPS, can communicate with App Gateway to figure out how to do encryption, and then just saves time and capacity on your backend servers as well. The last feature I want to mention, you can choose this when you set up your Application Gateway. It's what's called Web Application Firewall, or WAF, W-A-F. This is a different tier of App Gateway, and it provides some additional services at the App Gateway which protect web apps from common exploits. So cross-site scripting attacks or SQL injection attacks can be detected at the App Gateway rather than passing those back to servers in the backend pool. So when you set up an Application Gateway, which I'll do in the portal in just a moment, there's a couple of tiers. There are V2 tiers, and those are recommended because they just contain more features than the original tiers for Standard and WAF. So Microsoft recommends Standard V2 and WAF V2. You must have a VNet chosen when you set up Application Gateway, and you have to deploy it to an empty subnet. So the subnet is used by Application Gateway to be able to create multiple instances if they're needed. you must also set up a front-end IP address. You have to have at least one public IP for your application gateway. You can also additionally have a private IP if you want to support that or need to support that for applications. Your backend pool, as I mentioned before, is pretty flexible. It can be VMs, VM scale sets, even a Azure app service, a general IP address, which could be really located anywhere on the internet, or even a domain name. And then the routing rules you also set up when you create your application gateway. And so it's good to think ahead if you want to support multiple applications behind App Gateway for multi-site hosting, or perhaps for path-based routing. Let me show you how to set one of these up in the portal. We'll talk about its configuration as we go. So I'm in the marketplace. Look for Application Gateway. I'm going to create one. I'll create a new resource group. Let's see, I should have a resource group here too. I'll use this resource group. I'm going to call this Gateway 2. I'm going to put it in East US. My tier, notice the choices here, standard and standard v2, and then this would turn on Web Application Firewall for additional cost. Do you want to enable auto scaling? That's a feature of the v2 tier. So auto scaling means that if your application gateway gets very busy, Azure will automatically add an instance of your application gateway to support your backend pools. You could also turn that off if you don't need it. And then you do need to have a virtual network established here with a subnet that's empty. I have an empty subnet app GW. I need to specify a front-end IP. I'll add a new one. Specify a backend pool. So my target types here, here's where you can choose an IP address or domain name, a VM, a scale set, even an app service. So I have an Azure app service, I can pick that here. You would typically have multiple things in your backend pool. So I have a front-end IP called public. I have a backend pool established. I now need to add at least one routing rule. So a listener is what listens at an IP address and port. I'll call this listener 1. My front-end IP is established. That's public, which is here. What protocol and port am I listening on? Is this a basic or multi-site in case I was going to map this to multiple sites? And then I need to fill out backend targets as well. So I'm going to choose a backend pool, which is, there's my pool. I need to add what's called HTTP settings. And this establishes things like, do I want cookie-based affinity so that multiple requests from a user are sent to the same backend server? Do I want a drain connection over time so that I can consolidate requests into fewer servers? What kind of a timeout do I want for requests? Do I need to map host names differently? I'll leave all those as defaults and just click Add. Now I'm ready to add my routing rule. I'm done with configuration here. I can review and create, and Azure will set up my application gateway. While that's working, I'll show you I have another application gateway established already. Gateway 1. And you can see that the blades in here follow much of what we saw in the marketplace when I was setting up Gateway 2. There's the tier, instance counts, I had autoscale turned on for that. Web App Firewall is turned off here. I could turn it on. There's my backend pool. My backend pool has one app service in it. HTTP settings, my front-end IP. I have one public IP. I don't have a private IP configured. I have one listener listening on port 80. that's going to map to rule 1, which says send those requests to the backend pool. So App Gateway is another viable choice for web applications if you're deploying those in Azure.